The two politicians sat at either end of a long oak dining table. On the northern end of the room, a gray-haired gentleman with an outlandishly old-fashioned pair of mutton chops. His whale-gray top hat rested at a slight tilt upon his bald head, and if the hat were any bigger, it would surely consume him. He sawed delicately at his steak, shooting passing glances at his dinner partner across the way. She was a much younger woman, but only relatively. She was well past middle age at this point, but her deep auburn hair was only seldom interrupted by streaks of silver. She was a large woman, though being so overweight had no effect on her impeccable posture and extraordinarily dignified presence. She exuded more confidence than the somewhat weaselly man in the opposite chair. The mutton-chopped old man addressed the rotund woman between bites.
"I must say I am quite impressed, Harper. You have a truly lovely home and a talented staff."
Harper, having just finished her meal, pushed her plate aside and rested her elbows on the table. She folded her hands and pressed her supple chin down upon them.
"Oh, you're too kind, Eustace. There's still a lot of work to do. The stained glass, for instance, it's
Oh, no, it's brilliant. You say these windows here are temporary, but I'd never know. As far as I can tell, this is a veritable palace."
Harper smiled warmly, but her eyes betrayed skepticism. She looked the man before her up and down for any sign of his true intentions. She didn't say anything. She just waited for him to make his next move.
It's almost as breathtaking as your station."
And there it was, the unspoken reason for this whole meeting. Harper responded in kind.
"Oh, Eustace, you flatter me so, but it's not my station. It's the people's station."
Eustace adjusted his collar a little, as if he recognized he was entering dangerous territory.
"Come now, Harper, we both know that stations do not just spring up from a few stray seeds. It takes a strong leader to compel a town to put their blood, sweat, and tears into such an enormous public works project, especially a colossus like your Knapford station."
"Well, it was Topham who signed off on it, Eustace, and he did provide the financial backing."
Topham? Eustace winced when he heard that. In all his years of service to the railway, Eustace had never been on a first-name basis with Sir Topham Hatt, the superintendent of the railway network. He had to wonder if Harper called him that to his face. Were they that chummy? Eustace recovered.
"It's a big decision for a company, deciding to build a station. Look at Balladrin or Kellaby. The railway passes right by them. Why, if you had been the mayor of those towns instead of Knapford, you would have advocated for them. You would have made sure that they received stations themselves."
It was now Harper who winced.
"Ah, yes, well, it's hard to advocate for through stations."
She said the word through with unmistakable contempt. Eustace leaned forward. Having cleared his plate, too, he pushed it aside.
"Yes, well, you should know that very well. After all, Knapford is a through station, too."
And with a thud, he buried his elbows in the oak tabletop and rested his chin on his hands, too.
"Elbows off the table!"
snapped the mayor of Knapford. Regaining her composure, but leaving her own elbows firmly planted, she then mewed the word, "manners." Eustace slowly lifted his elbows from the table again, but they did not relax to his sides. Instead, he knotted them tightly across his chest.
"I mean no offense, Harper," he lied. "Your Knapford is the most important through station on the railway."
Harper tried not to grit her teeth.
"My dear Eustace, you appear to be misinformed. My Knapford is not a through station."
"So it is your Knapford now, is it?"
Eustace couldn't help but smirk. Harper blushed a little, though it was hard to tell under all the rouge.
"I do take some ownership of the station, as all proud Knapfordians do."
"Oh, naturally,"
grinned Eustace impishly.
"So then, if it isn't a through station, what am I missing? It isn't a junction. The Farquhar branch doesn't start until Elsbridge. And the Arlesborough extension, well, that begins at my station."
"Your station?"
"Yes."
confirmed Eustace, unwaveringly.
My station.
At last, Harper pulled her own arms from the table into her chest, mirroring her opponent. She jutted her head forward with feeling when she replied,
Knapford is the terminus of the railway.
Eustace's expression, first formal and then playful, finally turned dark. He furrowed those ancient, furry white eyebrows that nearly obscured his soulful eyes, and then responded with biting sarcasm.
Well, that's funny, because you see, my dear, it is my station which is the terminus.
A condescending smile split across Harper's face.
Your station was the terminus, old friend, when the railway began.
Eustace rose his eyebrows high, and a wild fury emerged in his eyes. He kept it under control for now, while he asked,
If that is true, my dear Mrs. Fullerton, then what does that make Tidmouth Station today?
Why, it makes it very important indeed. You see, if my station is the last on the main line, then yours is the first.
She paused for emphasis and then leaned in.
On the branch line.
Mayor Eustace Walsh rose violently from his seat, so violently, in fact, that the napkin tucked into his collar was whisked into the air and then tumbled to the ground. His arms had returned to the table, tense as a ship's tow line, bearing the whole weight of the man as he leaned aggressively in Harper's direction. We are not a branch line city, Mrs. Fullerton.
Harper remained in her same position, unfazed by the inevitable conclusion of this doomed dinner. She calmly flicked her own napkin from her shirt and replied with disinterest.
Oh, you're quite right, Mr. Walsh. Tidmouth is not a branch line city at all. It's a branch line town.
Eustace gnashed his teeth as his bitter rival continued.
Knapford, on the other hand, is a city. We just hit record numbers this year. The government authenticated us as Sodor's largest, in fact. It's thanks to all those new businesses, you understand. They've grown this sleepy settlement tenfold.
New businesses.
Eustace trailed off in disbelief.
New businesses. No, my dear. Old businesses. No. Stolen businesses. Stolen from us. Tidmouth was the industrial capital of this island before you came along.
Oh, you can hardly blame me, Eustace. I didn't steal your businesses. They left. They left because you weren't making it worth their while.
I bent over backwards for our local industries.
He was shouting now. If the 3 grand windows above them had been stained glass, they would most certainly have shattered during that sentence.
You wouldn't allow them to grow. You weren't giving up enough land, and your station and harbor just weren't big enough. If you had invested more money in those areas, your town would be a city by now. But you didn't. So it's not.
Enough talk, woman. I know how you beguiled some of my most trusted associates. You arranged dinners, just like this one, with our titans of industry. A.W. Dry & Co., Peel Godred Aluminum, Sodor Roadways. You got in their ears and fooled them into moving shop.
There was no treachery, Mr. Walsh. We simply did business. Knapford had plentiful land and a large unemployed population. Our old mayor was more concerned with lining his own pockets than improving the lives of his citizens.
Mortimer Palmer, he was a great man. We did business frequently, fairly and honestly. He knew how things were supposed to work.
Until he was arrested, of course, for collusion and embezzlement.
Harper rose a finely manicured eyebrow, her arms still folded in a posture of disdain.
You've only been at it for 5 years, woman. Palmer was mayor for 30 years. Sometimes, in politics, moral compromises must be made. You'll see that one day, if your gluttonous, ever-growing city doesn't consume itself by then.
At last, Harper stood up from her seat. To his embarrassment, Eustace Walsh visibly flinched at this. She spoke sternly to him.
You've insulted my city quite enough, Mr. Walsh. I think it's time you return to your town.
Eustace took a few steps back in surprise. He realized that he hadn't even made the proposition he'd come here to make. He had let his temper get the better of him, and now the dinner was ending prematurely.
Hold on now, Harper. We aren't done yet. We have business to discuss.
I have no business to discuss with you, Mr. Walsh. Please leave.
Harper, please, hear me out. I didn't want the evening to end like this. I wanted to come to an agreement.
Then you should have shown me more respect. Instead, you slander my city and glorify my corrupt, greedy predecessor. It's disgraceful.
Eustace was frantic. Can I at least please raise the issue that I came here to raise?
The sheds! You're here to talk about the sheds.
After Harper said that, Eustace was silent for several moments. At last, he replied in a somewhat whispery, hoarse voice.
You already know?
Of course I know, Eustace. What else could you possibly be here about? Frankly, I've been expecting you. I thought you'd confront me sooner.
So, you know what you're doing then. You know how it will ruin me.
A few moments later, his eyes widened as he reflected upon the sentence he had just spoken and realized that he had said me instead of my city. Harper, as always, was unfazed. Her tone of voice carried more pity than contempt.
It won't ruin you, Eustace. Your town still has the power station at the falls, the passenger traffic from the branch, and the general harbor freight. Those three are enough to keep your town alive.
Yes, but not enough to keep it relevant.
Harper pushed her chair in and began to walk away from the table and toward the hallway. She responded, almost sadly,
No, not relevant.
Eustace stood at the end of the table, standing straight as an arrow with his fists balled up painfully at his sides. It seemed as though he were about to cry, like a child whose favorite toy had just been taken from him. Shuddering, he began to speak once again, more slowly now.
Tidmouth was once the greatest town on the island, the heart of industry, the terminus of the North Western Railway. Such a legacy cannot go to waste.
Harper shook her head.
You know, I once idolized you. When I was a little girl, in the 90s, you had just been voted in. You had such a vision for your town then.
I still do,
whimpered Eustace.
Yes, but history has passed you by. Eustace, you saw your little village through the Industrial Revolution. You transformed it into a formidable town. You helped to build many of this island's industries from the ground up. Without your steadfast leadership, there would be no Tidmouth station at all. In fact, there might not be a railway at all.
There wouldn't be,
agreed Eustace resolutely.
It was an uphill battle, all the way. Why, the people I served back then, well, they were frightened of the railway. The first steam engines, it took a whole ad campaign to convince the public they were safe.
Yes, I recall.
Harper let up for a moment and gave the first genuine smile she had all night.
Coffee pots, I believe you called them, in the paper.
Yes, that's right, that was me.
Eustace grinned, remembering.
I thought it would make them sound less threatening, more relatable, you know.
You had a knack for that.
Harper nodded, showing true respect for the man he once was.
And it worked. And now we have steam engines. Thanks to you, Eustace.
Eustace perked up and smiled warmly at his fellow politician. But it wasn't to last.
But as your town grew, so did your ego. Industrialization made you rich. You lost touch with the villagers once they became your townspeople. They weren't treated well, Eustace. My father lost an arm to one of those cute little coffee pots. You could have put regulations in place to stop that, Eustace, but then your town wouldn't have grown as big or as quickly. Would it have?
Eustace shook his head.
You don't understand. I did what was best for my city.
Best for your city, or best for the people who lived in it?
Eustace stared into Harper's eyes glassily.
Aren't those the same thing?
Harper just sighed. The old Victorian simply couldn't grasp what she meant. At last, she decided this emotionally draining ordeal had gone on long enough. The trip down memory lane was over. They were in the present again. It was 1927. Things were changing, and there was nothing that either of them could do to stop the course of history now.
Good night, Eustace.
said Harper, with what little sweetness she could muster. But as she glided slowly into the hallway and away to her bedroom, Eustace addressed her one last time.
You know I can't let you do it, don't you? Those new sheds, they just can't go ahead. I'll have to fight you, every step of the way.
Harper nodded calmly.
I know you will, and you're going to lose.
And with that, the mayor of Knapford flicked a switch, and the glorious crystal chandelier above them went dark, becoming nothing more than a hanging mass of cold blue stalactites. The mayor of Tidmouth stood alone in the dark room, the cold blue light of late evening showering his miserable form. The conversation was over, whether Eustace liked it or not. So, slowly and painstakingly, he walked to the door, dragging his pride behind him like a heavy carriage.